We are presenting lobbying considerations for nonprofits, what your organization needs to know. My name is Janice Ryan. I'm a partner in Venable's Political Law and Nonprofit Practices.
Hi, and I'm Lindsay Nathan. I'm also a partner in Venable's Political and Nonprofit Group Practices, and I'm based in New York City.
And I'm in DC. We'll be presenting today, and I'm going to make sure that I can get my screen ready here for you guys. All right, so we have a lot of ground to cover today. We're going to present 5 major topics. Each of these topics probably could be the subject of its own webinar. We'll move through it as quickly as we can. But really, we wanted this to be an overview session and applicable to the range of nonprofit organizations that I think you all in attendance represent, primarily focused on 501c3s, 501c4s, and 501c6s. I'll kick things off by talking about the tax rules that apply to lobbying. Lindsay will go over the things that you need to know about lobbying disclosure at the federal, state, and local level, primarily focus on the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act as an example of the kinds of regulation that you may see. We'll talk about governmental ethics and gift rules. We'll talk about restrictions on lobbying activity or expenditures for lobbying activities if you are a federal contractor or grant recipient. And then we'll close things out by talking about some other related laws that impact your grassroots advocacy, primarily relating to communications. So we'll begin with tax rules. To begin, let's talk about 501c3s, and then I'll give you a brief overview of 501c4 and c6 lobbying. And then we'll talk more in depth about 501c3 rules. So I wanted to highlight at the outset that most of this presentation is going to be about the tax rules applicable to public charities that lobby, to the extent we're talking about 501c3 activity. Public charities are permitted to lobby and maintain their tax-exempt status as a 501c3, provided that activity is not a substantial part of the organization's total activities. We'll talk about that in more depth in a little bit. Public charities are absolutely prohibited from engaging in any activities to support or oppose candidates for elective office, which we'll call political campaign activities. Private foundations, on the other hand, which is another type of 501c3, are not permitted to lobby. Lobbying expenditures may be subject to penalty taxes. Private foundations can fund charities, public charities that lobby, but grants cannot be earmarked for lobbying. There are generally 2 kinds of grants that a private foundation could make to a public charity that is engaged in lobbying activity. You could make a general support grant without specifically having to restrict use of those funds by the organization for lobbying, or you could make a specific project grant that may include lobbying as part of the project, so long as the private foundation's funds do not support that aspect of the project. And like public charities, private foundations are absolutely prohibited from engaging activities to support or oppose candidates for elective office. The rules for 501c4s and 501c6s are basically the same. They may engage in unlimited amounts of lobbying. The thing that is important for tax purposes for these types of organizations is that the lobbying portion of dues that are paid by members of a 501c4 or 501c6 organization are not tax deductible by those members as ordinary and necessary business expenses. There are rules that require the organizations to keep track of the amount of money that they spend on lobbying and report to the members the amount of their dues that are related to that activity. Political campaign activities to support or oppose a candidate are permitted, provided they are not the organization's primary activity. We're not going to go into detail on this today because we're focused on lobbying, but if a C4 or C6 is engaged in campaign activities, they also have to be mindful of federal and state campaign finance laws, particularly with respect to restrictions on corporations engaging in activities to support or oppose candidates. So let's talk a little bit more about 501c3 lobbying. What is lobbying? And you're going to hear probably several definitions from us here today, which makes things fun. Lobbying for tax purposes for 501c3s is attempting to influence legislation, just legislation, at the federal, state, or local levels through direct or grassroots communications. 501c3s, public charities have two options for measuring compliance with the limitations on 501c3 lobbying. You can either measure your compliance under the no substantial part test, which is the default rule under the tax code, or the 501h expenditure test, which is a test that you can formally elect by filing a form with the IRS. If you decide to measure your lobbying activity under the no substantial part test, unfortunately, you have essentially an I know it when I see it test. It's a very vague facts and circumstances test. If the IRS were to determine that the organization had engaged in too much lobbying, so substantial lobbying, the organization could be subject to significant sanctions up to and including revocation of exempt status and the assessment of penalty taxes on the organization and its managers. The 501h expenditure test was enacted by Congress to frankly allow 501c3s greater comfort in engaging in lobbying activities without being afraid that they were engaged in excessive lobbying. And this test, if an organization chooses to elect it, basically requires the organization just to measure the amount of lobbying activity it incurs based on the amount of money that it spends. Lobbying will not be considered substantial provided the organization does not exceed expenditure caps, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. There are very clear definitions of what is and is not lobbying for specific activities. And should the organization exceed the caps in any particular year, there are actually very flexible sanctions. The sanctions are 25% tax on the amount spent over the cap in a year. There's no tax penalties imposed on the organization's managers for exceeding the limits. And revocation of exempt status results only if the organization exceeds a certain amount of expenditures over a 4-year consecutive averaging period. So these are the caps. And as you'll see, they're a sliding scale. A 501c3 that elects the 501h expenditure test is allowed to spend 20% of its first $500,000 of exempt purpose expenditures on lobbying. And then it's a sliding scale thereafter up to a hard cap of $1 million. If your organization's total exempt purpose expenditures would need to be approximately $17 million in order for you to hit that $1 million cap. So for many organizations, the 501h election makes a lot of sense. If you are an organization, however, that has exempt purpose expenditures greater than $17 million, the 501h election may not be the right choice for you because you would otherwise be subject to a hard $1 million cap in the amount of lobbying expenditures you could undertake in a given year. And for very large organizations, you may be able to do considerably more lobbying under the no substantial part test. The one important thing to note, as well as the $1 million cap here, is that grassroots lobbying expenditures under the 501h election are limited to no more than 25% of the total amount permitted for lobbying in a year. So it's important to understand that the caps apply differently to direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying. So what is the two different elements that we're talking about here? Direct lobbying is attempts to influence legislation through communications with covered officials that refer to specific legislation and reflect a point of view on the legislation. So again, for direct lobbying, we're talking to legislators and other covered officials. And that might include any member or employee of a legislative body, any government official or employee who may participate in the formulation of legislation, So consider the governor or a mayor or certain folks in the executive branch at really any level of government. And we're also talking about the public in a referendum, initiative, or constitutional amendment. So what does this mean? This means that when you engage in communications with the public to support or oppose a ballot measure, for example, the tax code considers that to be direct lobbying activity. What is grassroots lobbying? This is attempts to influence the general public through communications that have three elements, and it's really important. All three elements must be present, or else under the 501H election, you do not have a grassroots lobbying communication. The communication must refer to specific legislation, reflect a point of view on that legislation, and include a call to action. There could be many kinds of communications that you engage in with the general public that refer to specific legislation and reflect a point of view on that legislation. And if you don't have that third element, the call to action, you have not engaged in a grassroots lobbying communication that you need to track and report under your 501H caps. What is a call to action? Asking the public to reach out to their legislators, identifying a particular legislator as that recipient's legislator, as someone who will vote on the legislation, someone who is opposed to your point of view or undecided on that legislation, providing someone with a vehicle to contact that legislator. Perhaps it's a postcard or an email form or a petition, online or otherwise, and providing a way for folks to contact the legislature, providing contact information, telephone number, address, etc. If you don't include a call to action, you do not have a grassroots lobbying communication. The other thing that's really great about the 501H election is that there are specific exclusions from the definition of lobbying, which allow a 501c3 organization to engage in a wide variety of advocacy communications related to legislation without having those expenditures count against their 501H caps. So some of those exclusions include communication with your members regarding specific legislation. It's okay to have a point of view on specific legislation, but again, you cannot have a call to action. A category called nonpartisan analysis, study, or research is really important. A lot of 501c3 organizations can produce white papers and other kinds of research and analysis that provides a full and fair discussion of an issue, such that the person reading it would be able to come to an independent conclusion about the topic that you're discussing. And it's okay for you to, in that situation, reflect a point of view on specific legislation. Again, including a call to action is a factor as well. You could engage in discussions of broad social and economic problems, efforts to change regulations. Again, lobbying for tax purposes is efforts to change legislation. Requests for technical advice, conducting so-called self-defense activities. So advocating for your own interests as a tax-exempt organization, for example, and any time spent by your volunteers. All of those kinds of activity are excluded from the 501H caps. The key part of the 501H election is that you are not entitled to rely on the specific definitions of lobbying and the exclusions from lobbying unless you affirmatively elect by filing the form with the IRS to measure your lobbying activity under 501H. We are not in the thick of an election season right now for the most part, but there are state and local elections going on right now. And it's important to distinguish between lobbying and campaign activity. You know, in the course of your advocacy, it may be that you want to, as a 501c3 organization, explain to candidates your positions on various policy issues, and that is okay. But what is not okay is that you cannot engage in activities to support or oppose those candidates. Other kinds of activities in which you might be able to engage in would include nonpartisan electoral activities that are not only nonpartisan in that they're not supporting or opposing a specific party, but they're also unbiased, such that it is not something that the IRS would consider your activity to support or oppose a candidate. You could do get out the vote and voter registration drives, again, in a nonpartisan, unbiased way. You could prepare legislative voting records. You could host candidate debates and forums. And you could prepare candidate questionnaires and voter guides. In all cases, it's important for them to be inclusive, to provide a fair and impartial forum, and to cover a broad range of topics. If your organization is going to engage in these kinds of activities, it's important to consult with counsel to ensure that you're following IRS guidelines to avoid engaging in impermissible campaign intervention. So what can you do with candidates? You can urge candidates to support policies. So essentially you can lobby candidates. You should not ask candidates to take a pledge. So you should not ask them to commit to supporting your issue if they are elected, because the IRS views that kind of activity as an activity that supports or opposes a candidate in their election. You could provide policy papers and other materials to the candidate about issues, but you should provide that material to all candidates equally, and you should not create content at the request of candidates. So we're going to shift into 501c4 and 501c6 lobbying. The lobbying definition here is slightly different and broader than the definitions that we just went over for 501h, electing public charities. And you can find this in Section 162E of the code. Lobbying includes influencing legislation at the federal, state, and local level, influencing the general public with respect to elections, legislative matters, or referenda, influencing high-level federal executive branch officials with regard to executive and administrative actions, and political campaign activities, so anything to support or oppose a candidate for elective office. Why do we care? Because we know that 501c4s and c6s can engage in unlimited amounts of lobbying. As I mentioned earlier, there are no tax deductions available for lobbying under 162E of the code for your members who may be paying dues to your organization. A note about political campaign activity here. Again, political activities are permitted for a 501c4 or 501c6 organization under the tax code, so long as those activities are not the organization's primary activity. We'll talk a little bit further about the lobby tax rules. So an organization that engages in lobbying and has members that pay dues or similar amounts has two options under the tax code for ensuring that the members do not take tax deductions for the lobbying portion of their dues. The 501c4 or 501c6 organization can either notify their members annually of the amount of dues that are paid that are not deductible as a result of lobbying and political activity by the organization, or they can choose to pay what's called a proxy tax on those amounts directly to the IRS. Most organizations would prefer to provide the notice to members rather than pay tax on behalf of the members, essentially, for purposes of lobbying and political activity expenditures. Just another note about the proxy tax. This is something that's usually a prospective calculation based on prior year's activity. And chances are that you may have to go through what's essentially a truing up process on an annual basis. The IRS recognizes that the amounts that you spend at the end of the year may not be what you predicted at the beginning of the year, and you are able to carry over underreported amounts to the prior year's notices of dues to your members. And so this is something that that if you need help with, we do encourage you to contact counsel. Political activities expenditures are subject to tax under Section 527F of the code. And this is true, the tax rate is currently 21%, and it's assessed on either the amount of the organization's political expenditures or the amount of the organization's net investment income, whichever is less. If your organization does not have any investment income, it will never owe tax on the expenditures that are incurred by a 501c4 or C6 for political campaign activities. If you do, then you will have to consider the 527F tax in connection with any expenditures that you make in a given year and pay that to the IRS. So how does this all work together? Many of you may be representatives of affiliated organizations. A 501c3 organization may create a related 501c4 or 501c6 entity. There are no limits, as I said, on the amount of lobbying that a C4 or a C6 may conduct. And the C4 or C6 may establish a political action committee for the purpose of supporting or opposing candidates for office or engage in political campaign activities directly to the extent that's permitted under applicable campaign finance law. This means that a 501c3, a 501c4, and or a 501c6 can work together to accomplish your advocacy goals while complying with the specific restrictions under the tax code that may apply to that particular organization. It's important to note that the related 501c4 or 501c6 organization needs independent funding sources and that there is no charitable tax deduction available to the donors to the C4 or the C6. But the related organizations can share staff and office space subject to a cost sharing agreement. And to conclude, we'll talk just briefly about Form 990. Organizations that are engaged in lobbying or political activities will file Schedule C to the Form 990. For 501c3s, the sections that will be completed depend on whether you are a 501h electing organization or not. If you are a 501h electing organization, you need only report your lobbying expenditures on the form. Non-electing organizations must report in a little bit more detail the lobbying expenditures and the types of lobbying activities in which they're engaged. For 501c4s and 501c6s, you report your lobbying expenditures, the expenditures for any political campaign activity, and you'll calculate your lobby tax liability if there is any, or indicate that you will be carrying over into the next year any underestimate to your dues notices to members. How do we manage this? It's really important to be able to track and report your activities and expenses in order to comply with all of these rules and with the rules that Lindsay will go over shortly related to lobbying disclosure activity. Effective compliance may include having rules, clear rules for your staff to understand what is and is not lobbying, to provide training on that, and to be able to monitor periodically whether you are accurately capturing the information that needs to be captured. And I'll give a little shout out to timesheets, everyone's favorite thing, but timesheets can really be the most effective way of making sure that you're properly tracking staff time and other expenditures for lobbying activities. All right, Lindsay, do you want to take things over for lobbying disclosure?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much, Janice. So in this portion of the presentation, we'll talk primarily about federal lobbying disclosure rules, and then we'll touch briefly on state and local lobbying registration and disclosure. And then we will get into the ethics and gifts rules briefly. So just to sort of preview what we're going to talk about, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that there really is no uniformity amongst the federal and state laws, or even amongst the various states in terms of how they regulate lobbying activity and require disclosure. In some instances, as Janice mentioned, what the definition of lobbying will vary significantly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It doesn't always match the tax code. In fact, it often does not. In a lot of places, it goes much further, including activity related to influencing legislation, regulations, executive orders, procurement, Sometimes in states it regulates grassroots activities, and sometimes it even captures activities to cultivate goodwill with elected officials and their staff. In addition, who is a covered official, or the definition of covered officials will vary pretty significantly depending on where you are. Sometimes it's the legislature, sometimes it's the executive branch, sometimes it's both. Sometimes it includes only certain officials, and sometimes it's anybody who works for the state or local government in any capacity. As we'll get into on the federal side, there will be public reporting on the activity, the lobbying activity, and expenses associated with that activity. Sometimes you have to list the individual lobbyists and identify the amount of compensation you pay that individual lobbyist for their activities. Sometimes it's all aggregated together. As the theme of this presentation will be, it varies quite a bit depending on where you are. The other thing to keep in mind is that there may be limits on gifts or political contributions to members of the legislature or executive branch as a result of engaging in lobbying activities. So just keep that in mind. So what is the definition of federal lobbying? It requires a communication or contact, which in this case is a direct contact with a covered official. It could be oral, written, or electronic, and it has to be about federal legislation, federal regulations, program administration, nominations. There are some other categories of items that are included in the definition of federal lobbying, but those sort of cover the basics. It also includes activities to support lobbying communications, so time spent preparing for meetings, planning activities, research on, your lobbying activities, putting together talking points, all of that kind of activity would be included in the lobbying activity that's reported as well. Who is a federal covered official? So on the legislative side or congressional side, it's all members, officials, and employees of Congress. So, as it says on the slide, everyone from the receptionist to the chief of staff to the member is included. So if you are having a lobbying contact with anybody who works for Congress, then that would be considered a covered official. On the executive branch side, it's much more specific. It includes the president, the vice president, any member of the uniformed services whose pay or grade is at or above 0 to 7, any officer or employee in the executive office of the president, any officer or employee in a position listed in levels I through V of the executive schedule, and all Schedule C political appointees. Now, who fits into these various categories is sometimes obvious, but it can actually sometimes be tricky to figure this out. There are schedules that are published every 4 years at the end of a presidential term that we refer to as the Plum Book, and that has the list of everybody who is a Schedule C appointee or any covered officials, but it's not comprehensive. As I said, it's only published every 4 years, and definitely it needs to be double checked depending on when you're looking at it and who you're trying to identify. So one thing to keep in mind is that if you ever have any question about whether somebody is or is not a covered official, you can always ask them. And that's the only 100% surefire way to know whether they are or not a covered official, unless they fall into one of these other categories. So there are some specific exemptions to federal lobbying. So even if you're having a conversation with a covered official, if you are having conversations or contacts to accomplish any one of the items on this screen, then those would fall into the exemptions and you would not need to capture that activity, and it wouldn't count towards the threshold for having to register as a federal lobbyist. So this includes administrative requests. So if you're setting up a meeting, that doesn't count. If you are providing legislative testimony, if you are providing comments for the Federal Register, or if you've been subpoenaed, or if you're making speeches or doing any kind of mass communication, that activity would not be covered. So on that mass communication section, I want to highlight that grassroots lobbying is not covered under the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act definition of lobbying. Who is a federal lobbyist? So it requires more than one contact with a covered official. It requires at least 20% of your time over a 3-month period. So, and if you don't have both of those things, then you are not a federal lobbyist. It doesn't mean that you are not engaged in lobbying activity or that your time may not have to be reported if your organization or company is already registered to lobby, but you may not have to register as a lobbyist. This is one of those times when I will also put in a plug to consult with counsel if you're not sure, because what you don't want to do is have multiple contacts and exceed that 20% threshold and not be properly registered. So in terms of reporting under the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act, there are 2 types of reports. The first are quarterly reports of lobbying activity, the Form LD2, which contain information about the total amount spent on lobbying activities rounded to the nearest 10,000, information about which all of those expenditures include staff time. And as we talked about, that includes your direct contacts as well as preparation time, any compensation paid to outside lobbyists, lobbying expenses. So if you are, if you have expenses associated with your lobbying activities, you would include that. Any overhead, basically anything, anything that you spend on lobbying activities, if it qualifies as a lobbying activity, or if it's preparation or related to your lobbying activity, then you will include that. The interesting thing about the LD2 is, as it says here, it's rounded to the nearest 10,000. So if you have $10,499 of lobbying expenditures, you actually round down to 10,000. But if you have 10,501, then you round up to 20,000. So the amounts that are actually reported don't give a ton of insight or a ton of specific insight into what you're doing, but you can sort of get a range of what organizations and companies are doing in terms of their lobbying activities. In addition to the actual amounts of spending, you're also going to provide descriptions of the issues that you're lobbying on, the name of anybody who is a registered lobbyist that's registered on your behalf. And this, the LD2 is actually filed by the registrant organization. There are other lobbying disclosures that are filed by the individual lobbyist, which we'll talk about next. So in addition to the LD2, there's also a semi-annual report of political contributions, which is the Form LD203. This report contains information about contributions, including the categories listed here, honoring and recognizing payments, payments for certain meetings, presidential library contributions, and inaugural committee contributions. Again, this is filed by the registrant organization, but it's also filed by the individual lobbyists who are registered on behalf of those organizations. In addition to the political contribution certification, there's also a gift rule certification that confirms that the lobbyists have not given any improper gifts in violation of House and Senate gifts and travel rules. So this chart is just an overview of the sort of different types of lobbying activities that are regulated under the Lobbying Disclosure Act and the tax code. And as Janice mentioned before, you're going to hear a lot of different definitions of what lobbying is. And this, I think, gives you sort of a broad overview of how those activities are really varied across the various regulating entities and authorities. So in terms of state lobbying disclosure, as I previewed at the beginning of this section, I want to reiterate that the laws vary quite a bit across jurisdiction. And this says state, but you should assume that this also includes local jurisdictions. So sometimes states regulate lobbying, sometimes a local jurisdiction, a city or a county will regulate lobbying and have its own lobbying registration and reporting regimes. As I mentioned before, it could cover legislative branch, executive branch, grassroots activity, and goodwill contacts. So, you really should consult with counsel to understand what the various obligations are within each state. whether there are any local rules to follow, and how that might require you to be registered and reporting on the state or local level as well. The triggers for registration are quite different than the federal level in most cases. Sometimes it's based on a monetary threshold. So in certain places, if you spend X amount of dollars on lobbying activities, however that is defined under the state's rules or local rules as it may be, you may have to register as a lobbyist, or your organization may have to register as a lobbyist employer. Sometimes it's a number of hours, sometimes it's a percentage of your time spent on lobbying, and sometimes there's no threshold at all. So even one direct contact with a covered official will require your organization or an individual to register as a lobbyist. Occasionally, there are places where there are grassroots only filers. So if you are engaged in just grassroots lobbying activities and you don't make any direct contacts with a covered official, that grassroots activity may also require you to be registered and reporting on your spending and other activity related to lobbying. The reporting frequency for state and local lobbying varies quite a bit as well. Sometimes those reports are due on an annual basis, sometimes semi-annually, monthly, bi-weekly. It really, I can't say this enough, but it really does vary quite a bit across the board. Sometimes the reports will be very specific. They'll include, require you to say which bills you lobbied on or which issues you lobbied on, as well as whether you support or oppose those bills or issues or regulations. Sometimes they include very specific dollar amounts about your spending. It can sometimes break down with specific compensation for individual lobbyists. So if you have a staff member who has qualified as a lobbyist in that particular jurisdiction, you may actually have to indicate how much of their compensation was paid for lobbying activities. When you're thinking about your lobbying disclosure and compliance activities, another plug for the timesheets. So to the extent that you have staff who are lobbying on the state or local level, you definitely want to make sure that they are keeping track of their time so that you have a way to track it and report it. Here's some state lobbying issues to keep in mind. Many states prohibit political contributions by lobbyists or lobbyist employers. So if you're registered, your organization is registered, you may not be able to make contributions to candidates. That may be true. Now, obviously that doesn't apply to a 501c3 organization, but it would definitely apply to a C4 or a C6 organization. It may just be that it's prohibited during the legislative session. So there are also some temporal restrictions as well. I've mentioned the reporting and timekeeping requirements. The other thing to think about is there may be some special trainings, ethics or sexual harassment trainings is a new one that we see quite a bit now. You may have to get a badge and wear it whenever you're in a Capitol building. Not that any of us are traveling far these days, but once people are going back to lobbying in person, there are sometimes requirements to wear a particular badge identifying your status as a lobbyist while you're in the building. The other thing is that to the extent that you're engaged in lobbying activities, you may be subject to audits by the various regulators. If you are lobbying and you haven't been properly registered, or if you're not properly reporting your lobbying activity, people do notice. So not only could you have issues with the various regulators, but you might also have some PR issues as well. I think we want to go the other way. Yeah. So I think we'll pause for a second. Janice, do you want to give the code?
Yes, for those of you who are attending today's presentation for CLE credit, this is the important notice that you may be waiting for. The code for today's presentation is April nonprofit. April nonprofit. All right, thank you.
So I will jump right into the ethics and gifts rules. And I know we are running a little short on time, so I'll kind of run through this really quickly so we can get to the rest of the presentation. This slide, and we'll be providing this presentation to you all after the fact, so I won't go too far into this, but this is just meant to sort of give you a sense of how the federal gift rules vary based on who the recipient is. So you can see it's a little bit different depending on who you're talking about. What is a gift under the federal rules? It could be anything from meals and beverages to travel expenses, invitations to charitable events, tickets to other kinds of events, commemorative items and plaques, and books, periodicals, and informational materials. So it really is basically anything of value. I wanted to highlight a couple of the exemptions to the federal gift rules. Now, this is obviously not comprehensive, and I highly encourage you to consult with counsel if you're thinking about making a gift from your organization to federal or local or state official. But just to give you a sense of sort of what the different types of exemptions are, there are exemptions for certain types of receptions if you're offering nominal food or refreshments, and that generally does not include alcohol. There are exemptions for widely attended events, which is a term of art. It usually means more than 25 invitees from throughout a profession, not only members of Congress or members of the executive branch. Sometimes the official is speaking, but only in relation to their official duties. Entertainment at the event itself is okay, but entertainment after an event, sort of going to a ball game after a reception is not okay. There are exceptions for gifts of friendship. This is a little bit tricky. Obviously, you have to have a pre-existing relationship. You want to make sure that it's not expense to your employer. So in this case, this would be if you have a personal relationship with a member of Congress, but even then there are restrictions on what they can accept. For informational materials, you can give books or periodicals, but you can't give gifts of software. And then there are, of course, exceptions for items of nominal value, which include things like ball caps, t-shirts, greeting cards, and items that are under $10. For items of nominal value, there are very specific rules about that as well. So, obviously you want to make sure that this is something that you pay close attention to. Federal travel rules. Again, nobody's going anywhere these days, but hopefully one day soon we will all be back on flights. And you as an organization may pay for travel costs for federal employees, but there are very specific rules about how that works, and they need to be cleared by their ethics entities beforehand. I won't go too far into the details on that. I would suggest that since they have to be pre-cleared by House and Senate ethics, you definitely just want to make sure that you're checking the rules before you even offer travel to a member of Congress. In terms of state and local gifts and ethics rules, it's really important that you understand what the rules are in whatever jurisdiction you're talking about before you go to an event, before you offer a meal or even a cup of coffee in some instances. There are some states where, similar to the lobbying rules, where even a cup of coffee is a violation of the gift rules. Sometimes there's a specific dollar amount. Sometimes it's food and drink are okay, or widely attended events are okay, but seated meals are not. Or there's an items of nominal value exception. So just make sure that you know what the rules are before you give a gift to an elected official. And I wouldn't always assume that they know what the rules are or that they're necessarily following them. We all hope for the best, of course, but they can be very, confusing and, very varied. So you want to make sure that you understand before you do it.
All right, I'm going to take myself off mute and go over in a few slides some of the key restrictions for recipients, those of you who are organizations that are federal grantees or contractors, the things that you need to understand as a recipient of federal funds related to your advocacy. The first restriction that I'm going to highlight here is the Simpson Amendment. If you are a 501c4 organization under this portion of the Lobbying Disclosure Act, you are ineligible to receive any federal grant, loan, or award if your organization engages in lobbying activities. And we use the LDA definition of lobbying activities for purposes of the Simpson Amendment. So all of the rules that Lindsay went over in terms of what is and is not lobbying under the LDA is the rule that applies here. And importantly, this would not include grassroots lobbying because the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act does not cover grassroots lobbying. So this is about direct communications with federal officials. A 501c4 may, however, use a separate affiliated organization to engage in lobbying. So if you are a 501c4 organization that seeks a federal grant, loan, or award, you could consider creating and/or using a separate affiliate organization to engage in the lobbying activities that your C4 would otherwise engage in. The other important restriction that folks who have applied for federal funds in the past will probably be aware of, and if you haven't before, is called the Byrd Amendment. And the basic rule here is that federal funds may not be used to lobby Congress or the executive branch for a specific federal award. Your non-federal funds, so if you have funds from membership dues or other kinds of activities, may still be used to lobby for a specific federal award. The government will presume, according to guidance provided by the Office of Management and Budget, that non-federal funds are used in a lobbying effort so long as the award recipient has sufficient non-federal funds to cover those lobbying activities. So you cannot use federal funds to lobby for an award. You have to file what's called an SFLLL. This is a form to disclose any activities to lobby for a specific federal award. If non-federal funds are used to pay lobbyists for help in obtaining a federal award, you will have to disclose the name of the lobbyists that made contacts on your behalf with respect to that award. More broadly, if you are a federal contractor or a grant recipient, you will be familiar with the uniform guidance issued by the Office of Management and Budget, including the cost principles for grants and awards for nonprofit organizations. Some of you may have been familiar with the term Circular A-122. All the provisions of former Circular A-122 are now in Title II, Part 200 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And what's important to know is that you cannot bill expenditures for lobbying activities back to your federal award. So a federal grant recipient cannot be reimbursed out of federal grant money to influence federal, state, or local elections, or to influence federal or state legislation through direct or grassroots lobbying. Any membership dues that you pay to organizations that lobby are also unallowable costs. Similar principles are in the federal acquisition regulations, which apply to commercial and federal contractors, and they establish similar cost principles as are in the OMB Uniform Guidance. There is a criminal statute on the books. It's a permanent statutory prohibition on lobbying at all levels of government with federally appropriated funds. It was amended in 2002. It's very old, but it was amended to remove the criminal penalties in favor of the civil penalties that are now in place under the Byrd Amendment. That amendment also made this statute broadly applicable. Previously, it only applied to activities by officers and employees of the federal government. All of that said, it appears to have never been enforced to date, but it is important to keep in mind that this is in place. Lastly, but not least, and again, this whole section could be its own webinar, but usually there's a general rider included in annual appropriations, including omnibus bills that we see where all the appropriations bills are passed at once, that prohibits use of appropriated funds for lobbying or what's called propaganda or publicity purposes. And you can think of that as grassroots lobbying. There also are frequently specific statutory or appropriations limitations, particular to particular federal programs related to lobbying, and you may have in your particular award specific provisions in your contract. And so it's always really important if you are a recipient of federal funds and you think, oh, can we charge this cost back to the award? It's really important to look in all of these places to make sure that you understand whether and to what extent you're able to do that. Lizzie, do you want to kick not kick us off, close us out with grassroots
Take us
advocacy.
home.
Yes.
I will, yes. Okay, so this is obviously the most exciting part of this presentation. So for those of you who are engaged in grassroots advocacy, there are a number of different tactics that you may be using to do this work. Some of the things that are most popular these days are telephone and texting campaigns. So I wanted to sort of spend a minute talking about the key regulations related to those. First is the TCPA, which is the Federal Telephone Consumer Protection Act of 1991. And then there are also state telemarketing and auto dialer laws. As you heard me say about 100 times already during this presentation, the state rules on all of these activities vary quite a bit. So it's just important to understand that if you're going to be engaged in telephone or texting campaigns, that there may be rules around use of live operators, specific disclaimer language that you have to use, time restrictions, so you can only call within certain hours of the day, consent requirements depending on the type of calls that you're making and whether you're using an auto dialer, which we'll talk about in a second, and that the laws are continually changing. So for example, Virginia just enacted a new law related to telemarketing practices and auto dialer practices that covers text messaging. So the TCPA does apply to nonprofit advocacy calls and texts. There's a common misconception that if you have an advocacy message and you're not just telemarketing, that you actually don't need to comply with TCPA, but that's not necessarily true. The TCPA does require prior express consent in order to call or text a cell phone. The consent does not need to be in writing necessarily, but we do recommend it. And it is okay to deliver pre-recorded voice message calls or robocalls to landlines without prior express consent, but not to cell phones. Pre-recorded messages must contain certain identification information. So if you're going to do a robocall campaign, you need to ensure that you include the identity of the entity initiating the call. You have to state it clearly at the beginning of the message. And you need to provide the telephone number of the calling party at some point during the message or after the fact. Nonprofits are actually exempt from do not call restrictions, but sometimes nonprofits like to scrub their list for recipients who are on the do not call list, because there is obviously a lot of confusion about whether it does or does not apply from a consumer perspective. The other thing that we want to talk about a little bit, and I'll get into some new developments here, is peer-to-peer texting. So you don't necessarily need consent to do a peer-to-peer texting campaign. So that's generally thought of as, you have one human who's using some sort of software platform to send an individual text message to another human on their cell phone. As long as you're not using an auto dialer, you do not need consent, as we identified above in the TCPA section. So the thing that's been confusing and the thing that has been a recent development is that the definition of auto dialer has been litigated quite a bit over the last couple of years, including against nonprofits, nonprofit organizations. There was a very recent Supreme Court decision, the Facebook versus Duguid case, which sort of more specifically defined what constitutes unprohibited automatic telephone dialing system, or auto dialer, under the TCPA. So the Supreme Court held that the device must have the capacity to either store or produce a telephone number using a random or sequential generator. That means that the telephone number must be pulled out of thin air and then called or texted. So if you have a list of phone numbers that you have that you are texting and they're preset, then that would not seem to apply here. However, there is an open question of what capacity means in the context, and I would imagine we'll see some more litigation over this question in the years to come. The other thing that the Supreme Court did not address is whether human intervention is relevant. So, the prevailing theory and the theory in certain circuits was that if an individual is actually the sender of that message, then the TCPA did not apply. The Supreme Court did not actually address that question, so that's still a little bit of an open question. So other things to keep in mind when you're engaged in telephone and texting campaigns, in addition to the regulatory framework, there are some best practices for SMS campaigns. We always recommend that you require opt-ins before you begin texting, especially, obviously, if you're using an auto dialer, you need one. If you're not using an auto dialer, it's still great if you have one. We always recommend that you honor opt-out requests. And that you scrub lists for individuals who have requested not to receive text messages from your organization. There are calling hour restrictions and best practices for calling hour restrictions. So even if the specific state doesn't require that you call before or after within a certain time period, I should say, we usually recommend that you limit your texting or calling campaigns to between 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. There are also industry best practices and wireless carrier requirements that you should be familiar with. The Mobile Marketing Association and CTIA have put out some guidelines, so it's important that you're aware of what those are. And then finally, there are some recommended disclaimers for calls to action, confirmation messages, and program messages. We always encourage everybody to include certain disclaimer language in your text messages. Sometimes it's at the beginning when you get the first message. Sometimes it's actually in the call to action. So if you have an advertisement where you want people to text in to receive messages from your organization, you should include a specific disclaimer there as well. Email. So obviously every organization has an email list, and those email lists are very precious, but you have to be aware of the requirements under CAN spam and other marketing rules related to mass emails. So CAN spam applies to unsolicited email advertising or promotional commercial products or services. Advocacy emails are obviously not likely to be commercial advertising, but you just have to be careful that you understand those rules and make sure that they do not apply to your organization or your email. You want to make sure that you follow best practices when it comes to emails. So you should send all emails from a legitimate active email address that can receive incoming emails as well. The from line should accurately identify the organization or the sender. The body of the message should contain a postal address. It can be a PO box, but you should have an address. You shouldn't have misleading subject lines or content in the body of the message. If you are advertising some sort of promotional product or service, you should include advertisement in the subject line or somewhere in the body of the email. And then obviously you have to have an opt-out, and it should be, a simple way to opt out of those mass email messages. If your organization is engaged in any broadcast advertising, so television or radio, just be aware that there are lots of requirements, including FCC sponsorship identification requirements, which requires a disclaimer at the end that identifies the full legal name of the sponsoring organization. If you are engaged in any electioneering communications, which refer to federal candidates close in time to an election, 30 or 60 days, depending on which type of election it is, it requires a specific disclaimer identifying the sponsoring organization and that it was not coordinated or authorized by a particular candidate or candidates committee. It requires a voiceover and has specific size and duration requirements as well. Certain state and local jurisdictions also have electioneering communication requirements. So, for example, in the upcoming New York City elections, New York City and New York State both have electioneering communication requirements. So if you are planning to run any ads to, sort of talk about specific candidates and their positions on things, be aware that those also might require specific disclaimers and may also be subject to reporting and registration obligations as well. And then finally, I wanted to just mention quickly that state political advertisements may also have other types of disclaimer requirements. You might have to include, the name of your top donors, you may have to, or names of your top donors, you may have to include the names of your CEO. They may have voiceover or other disclaimer requirements as well. For digital advertising, the sponsorship identification requirements are going to vary quite a bit depending on the content and platform. So for example, if you're posting advertisements on paid advertisements on social media platforms, most of those platforms have their own sponsorship requirements. You'll see at the top of a Facebook post, for example, that the ad was paid for by a specific organization. And typically the platforms require the full legal name of the organization. They will verify your organization before they will allow you to actually do paid advertisements on their platforms. Other types of digital ads, static ads, homepage, website homepage takeovers or newspaper homepage takeovers, that kind of stuff will require different kinds of disclaimers and formats for those disclaimers depending on the type of content. So just make sure that you're aware of whatever disclaimer requirements and disclosure requirements are associated with the type of advertisements that you're planning to run. Oh, also wanted to mention that digital radio disclaimers are different than broadcast radio disclaimers. So if you're running ads on Spotify or Pandora, for example, it may require a different kind of disclaimer than on a broadcast radio station. And finally, I just wanted to touch very briefly on privacy rules and data collection. So, you want to make sure that your nonprofit has reviewed your privacy policies and that it actually matches what you are doing and what you're doing with data that you're collecting. You should make sure that you're addressing the use of cookies and analytics tools in that privacy policy, and that you are disclosing to your donors and others what you're doing with your data. And that is something where I would highly recommend that you talk to privacy lawyers or individuals who specialize in privacy rules to make sure that your privacy policy is compliant.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you all for staying with us today. We went a little bit over. We know that you have questions. We will go through all of those and we'll respond to them after this presentation. I hope that you will stay tuned for an email from Venable for next month's webinar, which I understand will be about the legal considerations related to returning to work or staying remote, which is something that we're all mindful of these days. Thank you again, and we hope you have a really great day.